Good morning to the audience in Glasgow COP26 and to the international audience, good day from Australia. We are live streaming here from a few different jurisdictions from GBPN team and stakeholder bodies. And to this end, I'd like to pay respect to the culmination of the original country from where I am live streaming. And I say this not in a perfunctory way, but in a respectful way, for a lot of the traditional knowledge and indigenous context is very much relevant to the context of building and energy. So to that extent, I pay my respect to the traditional owners of the land that I'm live streaming from, and I also share that sentiment with all my other colleagues here. We are in the Business Pavilion for Climate Leadership, and today is the Energy Day. It's about building's role in the energy transition. So my name is Jaswin Yogaratnam, and I'm the Head of Policy Reform at Global Buildings Performance Network and the Monash University Regional Program Office for Asia Pacific. We have a great lineup today of diverse talent and expertise, and I'm very privileged to be here today because I'm sharing this platform with very esteemed and dear colleagues of mine from various jurisdictions. So the aim today is really for us to talk about the how to. Over the last few days, you would have heard about the why and the what in terms of energy transition. Today, we're talking about the how to, for that is the core business in policy reform of GBPN. We're going to talk about the how to develop and implement policy reform that plan to help countries achieve their national determined contribution. Experience from policy developments on the ground in Indonesia and regionally will be shared by key policymakers and experts. We'll explain 7 key strategy policy reforms that GBPN has applied in country and share insights on how they are applied to guide the development of low emissions building. Importantly, also, we will share how some of this has applied in some of our pilot projects in Indonesia. For the focus today is really in relation to implementing net zero emissions policy reforms in Southeast Asia's building sector. On that point, it's good to note that the International Energy Agency has noted that COP26 will aim to finalize the ground rules on NDCs and to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Annual clean energy investment worldwide must more than triple by 2030 to around $4 trillion annually, with 70% of additional spending to close the gap between announced pledges and the 1.5-degree compatible trajectory that is needed to engaging in developing economies. The World Bank itself has put together 3 pillars. Number 1, to integrate climate and development. Number 2, to identify projects at country level, which is where GBPN is actively engaged, to tackle mitigation and adaptation. And number 3, to channel appropriate sources and structures of financing toward these projects in a manner that maximizes impact. With that, I'll now like to move on to the proceedings of the day. So it's structured in a way where we have 2 presentations to begin with, followed by a panel session. To begin with, we have our first intro speak by our very own board member, Jane Hedley. Some information on Jane. So Jane is a global leader in driving change in the building sector, being much needed to bridge the gap between market lead and government actions. Expertise is in strategy, finance, operations, and as a CEO and management consultant. She's a staunch believer in the power of people and local action as the biggest source of power to achieve anything we put our minds to. So I hand over the floor to Jane.
Jane, you're on mute.
No, we don't hear it.
You're still on mute, Jane?
Can you hear me now?
Loud and clear.
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Good morning, Scotland. Good morning to all my Green Building Council colleagues and World Bank colleagues and people that are on the ground there. We're coming to you from the other side of the world, the evening and the afternoon. It's great that there's a second actual building focused day at COP. I know the last one was in Paris several years ago. So congratulations on all the work and pulling this together. It's fantastic. I remember back in COP15 in Copenhagen, that was the first time we had a delegation of people going to the COP to actually represent the common voice of the building sector. So it's been 11 years of participating in these events to really showcase how important the building sector is to unlock the challenges in the complex value chain that we have. And so it's great to be with you today to be talking about some of our amazing projects on the ground in Indonesia. I think it's really interesting that none of us are there at COP. So we know that COP is a very top-down event, and it's a very important to get the top-down right. And it's very appropriate that us coming to you from the other side of the world, we have a very bottom-up focus. So our focus is entirely on how we empower local action. Those of you who know the GBPN, the Green Building Performance Network, we used to be a policy think tank. So we were really good at doing research and writing reports and pulling together best practice policy methods. But we saw a gap a few years ago of those actually being used and implemented. And so GBPN 2.0 has really taken the complete opposite approach, and we've flipped from being a think tank to a do tank. And so today is really about unpacking our new way of working to empower the people on the ground in countries to be able to take the knowledge that we've gathered over the last quite a few years, all of the amazing tools and information and research that we have, to actually implement it on the ground and really bridge that gap between knowledge and implementation. And that's our real focus for today. So as Jez said, I'm focused on people. I'm all about people. And one of the things that I found over many years is that collaboration and working in partnerships between government and industry and different NGOs and different groups is actually really hard. And so there's particular roles that get left out, and that is that role of the facilitator and the role of the groups and the platforms and the ways that we come together as different entities into one common vision and one common direction. So I'm really excited to hear from the team today and for them to share with you about what they're actually doing and how we're actually creating some models that enable that. So we go from really having a policy focus to a people focus. Me coming from New Zealand, we have a term here called kaitiakitanga, and that means guardians of the earth. And so I really see that we are creating many kaitiaki or guardians within government and within Indonesia today and in other countries that we work, and really enabling and empowering people to actually be what they want to be, and that is to take responsibility and take action for their own environment. So on that note, thank you for joining us today, and I'd like to hand over to Peter to get into some of the detail about GBPN. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. And on the note of people, GBPN is very much into the people-centered approach, and I think Peter will move on to discuss some of the top-down developments on implementable building sector actions on the NDC that GBPN has been involved in. Just a bit on Peter. Peter is clearly one who has developed lots of strategies on the building of networks within civil and private sector to decarbonize the building sector. He's also very passionate about enabling personal transformation through education as a catalyst for the global change. The floor is yours, Peter.
Thank you, Jasmine. Thanks, Jane, very much for those stirring words in the introduction. I'm going to share my screen to begin a short presentation. Okay. So what I'd like to do today is, as Jane mentioned, we have been developing a lot of capital in knowledge and best practices, and we've made this shift to think how do we really bring that down to enable change. And so I want to provide some insights into the how-to of implementing zero emissions policy reforms in Southeast Asia's building sector. And it's really important to be looking at Southeast Asia, first of all, in aggregate, because taken together, the economies of Southeast Asian nations represent the fourth largest building sector emissions globally. And so if we can aggregate all of the efforts of our communities in this region, we're going to make a major impact on global emissions. So today we've got a pretty clear idea of what kind of policy reforms are necessary to achieve zero emissions buildings and to decarbonise the building sector. Policy packages, we know, with combinations of mandatory energy codes, rating and disclosure policies, and finance and incentive programs really do work, especially if they're aligned with zero emissions targets. We're now aware of the need to take a whole of life approach with policies designed to achieve life cycle emissions, and we heard a little bit about that in earlier sessions in this pavilion. We also know that we need to take an integrated policy-making approach to achieve the necessary 3 pillars of decarbonisation, which are maximising building energy efficiency, fuel switching to electrification, and integration of renewable electricity supply. So really, lack of awareness of what to do isn't really the barrier. The real issue is knowing how to incorporate these actions into implementable and fundable plans, including in NDC commitments. So today I would like to share some insights from GBPN's experience in guiding climate policy actions and implementation. And I'll start by sharing some lessons learned from supporting top-down approaches, such as the Global ABC and International Energy Agency's roadmaps for buildings and construction. And then later, I'll hand over to Sandra Pranato, who will be explaining our bottom-up approaches. But of course, effective policy reform requires both top and bottom to be working together and be aligned. So that's the top-down, which I'm going to describe, and then later Sandra is going to be talking about our process of bottom-up approach with the examples from Indonesia. All right, so our approach to supporting top-down policy reform planning is pretty well described in the Guide for Incorporating Building Sector Actions in NDCs, which we developed for the Global ABC. This approach has 3 stages that are conducted through strategic stakeholder engagement. Mapping is the first stage, and it determines the status of a market in terms of building stock, energy demand, associated emissions, stakeholder mapping and capability assessment. And importantly, it generates the data necessary for the next phase, which is the prioritization phase. In prioritization, we engage stakeholders in a process of determining which actions provide the best impact and contribution to climate and other public policy goals. Implementing and monitoring plans come next, and they're designed with stakeholders to ensure buy-in from the agencies and the industry sectors that are responsible for actually doing the transformation and achieving the progress towards zero emissions outcomes. So I'd like to share a little bit now about what that looks like in practice. So here's an example of the mapping phase, some output from a building stock modelling project that we're conducting in Indonesia. This graph shows measured and projected changes in embodied and operating emissions over time for landed housing in Indonesia, which represents the majority of the housing stock. With this baseline data, policymakers can be guided to determine a set of policy reforms that will be effective in flattening that cumulative emissions curve. A measured, reportable and verifiable baseline like this is a requirement for proposals seeking funding under many climate finance mechanisms, because the impact of proposed actions, like introducing new residential building energy codes, for example, can be quantified. Part of the work that we've done in the region has demonstrated there is not really one common methodology for being able to establish baselines. So we're looking at bringing back a tool that was developed for the NAMA programs in Southeast Asia a few years ago called the Common Carbon Metric. Once we've done the mapping, we move to prioritization. Now, The MRV baselines are established and relevant actions are identified, and they can be prioritised in a number of ways. One filter for prioritising actions is how much of a contribution they make to existing climate action commitments. This slide shows the kinds of building sector commitments being made by state and non-state actors in Southeast Asia for both mitigation and adaptation. You can see that the private sector and municipal commitments are prevalent in Southeast Asia, meaning that building sector actions can be aligned with commitments in countries whether or not the NDC currently includes the building sector. National adaptation plans can also be assessed. Here you can see that in Southeast Asia, reviewing and updating building regulations and standards is the most prevalent building sector adaptation measure, providing an opportunity for incorporating minimum performance requirements. We can also prioritise by working with stakeholders to analyse criteria such as the fundability of proposed actions, their climate impacts, the time frame for achieving results, their likelihood of success, and what the cost of inaction might be. This slide shows the outcomes of a stakeholder workshop process we helped to facilitate in Cambodia with the UNEP and UNDP, where we analysed the key roadmap actions against these sorts of criteria. You can see in this case that stakeholders identified implementing building energy performance codes for residential buildings and implementing appliance efficiency standards for air conditioning and cooking as priorities. Through the prioritisation process in both Viet Nam and Cambodia, there was a recognition that climate actions in the building sector can contribute to achieving other public policy priorities as well, including, for example, sustainable cities and urbanisation, promoting sustainable post-pandemic economic recovery and climate resilience. This opens up the opportunity for actions to be repackaged into options for policy reform that achieve these goals in the process of decarbonising the building sector. Both Viet Nam and Cambodia have completed their NDC roadmaps for buildings and have included buildings actions in their NDCs. We've had the opportunity to write a review of the building roadmap process for Global ABC and the UNDP, which provided some key insights on how to develop policy reforms from the top down. These include not letting a lack of data be an excuse for avoiding tackling important reforms, such as introducing residential building energy codes. Instead, make filling the data gaps an integral part of the policy reform plan, which remains a living document that can be continually improved. We can broaden stakeholder engagement as well to include stakeholders that represent aligned non-climate interests, such as departments of public health. And broader stakeholder engagement processes also lead to new opportunities for developing buildings actions for NDCs that work across policy portfolios. We like to emphasise this point because, after all, low emissions buildings can be a solution for problems other than climate change. So that gives you some insight into how to implement a top-down approach to planning policy reforms for achieving zero emissions buildings. But they can't work without also implementing effective bottom-up reform strategies. So that's where I'll hand over now to Jess and to bring Sandra into the conversation to walk us through the bottom-up approach. Thanks again.
Thank you, Peter, and great takeaways in relation to the top-down integrating into the bottom-up approach that GBPN applies in the jurisdictions we work at. And to that end, we perhaps move into Sandra Pranoto. Sandra Pranoto is our Indonesia Senior Advisor at GBPN. She is also a lecturer at the Green Building Policy and Finance and Indonesia Banking Development Institute, an experienced private sector development and green building specialist on policy reforms in East Asia, particularly in Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, and Myanmar. She is one who's highly passionate in promoting new pathways to advance a sustainable and robust green growth through policy reforms and market creation in emerging countries. She is also the matriarch of GBPN's team in Indonesia. So the floor is to you, Sandra.
Thank you, Jess. Good morning, Glasgow, and good afternoon, evening for everyone in other parts of the world. Thank you for the opportunity today to share about the GBPN's 7 key strategies for supporting long-term policy reform. I will start the presentation actually by sharing a bit about Indonesia as a pilot case here and why these 7 strategies fit perfectly in helping emerging markets like Indonesia and other similar countries in the region in tackling climate change issues through a sustainable policy reform process. So in the next slide, we'll see that currently Indonesia is among the top 5 emitters in the world with its rapid urbanization, where the growth of the cities are expected at more than 4% per year, which is among the highest in the region. The energy intensity is expected to increase as well, especially from household and commercial. According to an ISR study looking at all sectors from the period of 2013 through 2019, it was clear that building sector consumes more than 60% on average of the total Indonesia's electricity consumption. However, buildings are not always part of the problem here, because it could also become part of the solution, as well as which is noted also by IFC, which is in one of their studies, they mentioned that 80% of the climate investment opportunity by 2030 actually lies in buildings more than any other sectors. So the government of Indonesia has also set several climate goals, from NDC target of 29% carbon reduction without the international support, or 41% of reduction with international support by 2030. And the most recent one is the issue, this net zero emissions, which is targeted to be achieved by 2060 or earlier. However, the issue is that there are still lack of urgency and understanding on the huge potential that building can actually contribute to those targets, which results in the absence of a clear policy and roadmap on housing energy. And because of that, then in the next slide, we'll see that GBPN is here to help the country in creating these affordable, healthy, and comfortable homes with low carbon emissions. Our priorities, so if actually to support the government, then the key stakeholders in numerous activities that not only focusing on the policy reform, developing a sound policy and roadmap on residential building sectors, but also increasing the understanding, the awareness, the capacity of the policymakers and market players on the net zero emission residential buildings. We are grouping our activities into 3 main approaches or themes here, which is the first one is public policies and incentives, working hand in hand between national and subnational government to work on the policy reforms that can be really implemented well on the ground. And then secondly, on the market knowledge, technologies, and financing, creating sustainable and robust building market that use applicable technologies and provide access to finance for business to grow. And in the end, we also raise awareness among stakeholders, so more people will realize the huge potential of this sector and become a believer of this movement. In the next slide, we'll see the policies that were issued in the past almost 1 year in Indonesia. So Indonesia, for almost a decade, has launched several green building related policies at the subnational level and also at the national level. From the National Green Building Codes that was just recently revised and issued. And before that, even there are some local green building regulations that were issued at major cities like Jakarta, Bandung, and Semarang. While it's quite encouraging to see all this development, but numerous gaps have been identified as well, from policy drafting, licensing process, data collection, capacity and monitoring, which make those green building policy implementation and replication becoming a bit challenging here. So therefore, there is a need for a reform strategy that really works here in Indonesia. Next slide, please. So then that's why GBPN here, we developed these 7 strategies to support, enhance, and stimulate better public and private sector coalition and coordination toward meeting the nation's climate goals through developing and implementing a sound policy that is evidence-based, that addresses the right issues and that is applicable on the ground. The methodology that we use is a bottom-up approach, like what Peter mentioned, that through series of consultations with local and national experts in HIDUP coalition. HIDUP itself is this formal group of building and policy experts from various backgrounds, policymakers, academicians, consultants, private sectors that meet regularly to discuss policy reform opportunities on net zero emission buildings. And we got also insights from GBPN's international community, and we also get results gained from our pilot municipality in Indonesia. So these strategies has been tested here in Indonesia in one of the municipalities. And next slide, please. And if we're talking about these 7 strategies, these are the key ingredients in the policy reform process. It all starts with the importance of building stakeholders engagement policy platform or coalition among the key stakeholders to ensure that all is working toward common goals based on their roles and responsibilities. This coalition can be the embryo for an effective policy dialogue where policy challenges and opportunities can be identified early. And on second one, under data, in order to clearly see the issues and determine the policy targets, an effective policy needs to be based on a clear set of data. We're talking about evidence-based policy here of the current condition, where we are right now, baseline, what we want to accomplish, where, when do we want to accomplish that, the targets. So how we're going to close that gaps, how we're going to meet those goals. So all those things need to be clearly defined based on the data that we have. And then we can also then continue with having not only the policy, but also the roadmap that will identify all those ways to meet those targets. And under strategy 3, we're talking about integration here. We're talking about how we should encourage this vertical and horizontal policy integration interventions to ensure harmonization of all of these policies, because policies actually could come from subnational and also come from national level here. So so we need to ensure there's a smooth on-the-ground policy implementation process in emerging markets with strong decentralization system like Indonesia. Unfortunately, it is quite common to have overlapping of regulations at the vertical between national and local governments, and also horizontally between ministries and national agencies. So we need to really apply this strategy to ensure that there's no overlapping of regulations and there's no confusion in terms of the policy implementation. In addition, with incentives could actually play a crucial role here also to ensure that policy is adopted by all players. And in strategy number 4, we're talking about the increasing capacity of all players here. Public and private sectors is important here to ensure that the knowledge gap is closed, that everyone is on the same page in terms of understanding, in terms of their level of knowledge, in terms of having the same goals, ambition on the sector, and also on the policy reform initiatives. And then also with the education, the importance of establishing a learning management system to also include climate solution education campaigns to ensure that sustainability of the policy reform process here. This reliable system and campaign can help educate a lot of people on the net zero emission residential building issues and raise community awareness. At the same time, it will also help to create a long-term buy-in from the public on why this sector is important for them, on why this policy also important to them, and why all this policy reform initiative will impact their lives, their community, and also their country. And also, what is important is having this effective policy is that this effective policy should also be able to open doors for private sector participation here, especially for investment to come in and be able to help the government who might have limited resources in getting the maximum benefit from that policy. As we know, sometimes it's not about lack of funding from external parties to support, the project or government project or government business here, rather than a lack of bankable projects actually in the country. So the government should create a policy that will also enable the business to prosper, to grow here. The policy reform programs also need to be supported. For example, in the context of achieving NDC targets, they need to be supported. and relevant enough to be funded by international climate finance. Critical to this is ensuring a data-driven and stakeholder-led approach. And in the end, the regulatory system, which is we're still under, in the end, that the regulatory system needs to be. Can we go back to the slide before? Yeah. So under scale, in the end, the regulatory system needs to be responsive and prevent the country in reinventing the wheel or repeating the same mistake. At the same time, it should allow also scaling up of this policy initiative. The system should promote this peer-to-peer learning opportunities among the policymakers and allow the policy implementation to be monitored well. So the local governments do not have to look far for successful policy reform initiatives here. If their neighbor cities can do it, they can also do it, or even deliver it better than their neighbor cities or their neighbor countries. So those are the 7 strategies. But then now we see in the next slide, in how does it actually work in Indonesia through GBPN ongoing initiatives. So you see GBPN initiatives, although GBPN 2.0, like Jane mentioned, just started, I think, 2 years ago, and just started actually in Indonesia actively 1 year ago. But then there are several initiatives that are already ongoing at the national level as well at the subnational level. At the subnational level, we work closely with the Samarinda government as well as Bali government in promoting their in Bali, we're promoting their Bali clean energy policy, but in Samarinda is actually we're promoting their initiative to become the first city outside of Java Island that will have these green building regulations. And we started that by having this stakeholder approach, inviting all the experts and then also informing of and then working together with them in Hidup Coalition as well, and then ensuring that all the inputs from them, including data, will be something that we will use in making right recommendations for them, because all those bottom-up approach inputs coming from them, also from the national government, will be something that we will use in order to make right recommendations for cities like Samarinda or for province like Bali. At the same time, we also work with the national government here. We want to make sure that all these policy initiatives that are happening on the ground at the subnational level could also be something that inspired, could also be something that follow on by the national government. So Hidup Coalition here is that avenue for everyone to actually exchange policy insight, opportunities, and then also work out toward the same goal, the common goal here. And by linking the national
just to note timing, Sandra, we on.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, this is the closing one. So we are so these strategies we are piloting and refining as a living process that focus on enabling sustainable policy reforms. Thank you. Sorry for running.
Thank you, Ibu Sandra. And what Sandra has noted in terms of the 7 policy strategies is one that has been tested through a policy platform that GBPN tested over a year with a multilateral platform called Hidup, which means alive in English, in Bahasa Indonesia. And it had all the multilateral experts from different sectors coming in to discuss how to policy develop in the context of decarbonizing the built environment. And those 7 strategies were found to be ideal, and it's currently being tested in some of our pilot jurisdictions in Samarinda, for example. Moving on, we've got a video clip to share with you. It demonstrates the voices of some of our key stakeholders. As mentioned earlier, we are based on a people-centered approach, and this particular segment demonstrates that.
Tadi kita sudah melaksanakan kegiatan terkait smart building dan green building. Jadi kegiatan yang dilaksanakan oleh BNI GBPN bekerja sama dengan P4 ini sebenarnya sangat bagus, apalagi momennya ini sesuai dengan PP 16 tahun 2001 terkait pelaksanaan Undang-Undang Bangunan Gedung.
Ini adalah kegiatan yang sangat-sangat bermanfaat, kegiatan yang membahas hal-hal yang sudah seharusnya kita bahas agar supaya kita mendapatkan mutu kehidupan yang lebih baik.
Saya rasa ini sangat bermanfaat sekali ya, apalagi kan saya dari sisi pendidikan. Artinya kalau kita ingin benar-benar mau mendorong, menggalakkan masyarakat lebih sadar terhadap green building ini, ya berarti salah satu ombaknya itu adalah institusi pendidikan, karena dia yang akan menghasilkan sarjana arsitektur kan, yang nantinya akan menghasilkan arsitek-arsitek di kemudian hari. Terima kasih, saya Risna, dosen di Universitas 17 Agustus 45 Samarinda. Hadir di sini bersama mahasiswa, bisa mereka menerapkan apa yang menjadi idenya GBPN dalam desain mereka nantinya, dalam mendesain rumah tinggal ataupun bangunan publik lain yang bisa green, menjadikan Samarinda green, menjadikan Samarinda setara dengan kota-kota besar di Indonesia.
Dan mudah-mudahan mereka juga bisa, bapak-bapak dan ibu di sini bisa menangkap message yang kami sampaikan bahwa low carbon atau zero carbon itu penting, dan untuk mencapainya itu tidak sulit gitu ya. Yang dibutuhkan adalah kemauan untuk melakukan hal itu.
Baik, Provinsi Bali menjadi salah satu daerah pertama di Indonesia yang menerapkan kebijakan energi bersih atau clean energy. Hal ini kami lakukan dengan mengoptimalkan potensi-potensi yang ada di daerah, terutama untuk potensi energi bersih maupun energi baru terbarukan.
Tentunya kita Core Udayana bersama GBPN itu bisa memberikan sumbangsih yang cukup besar kepada pemerintah Provinsi Bali, khususnya di bidang bimbingan bantuan teknis, yaitu seperti misalnya melakukan analisa berbasis data tentang kebijakan yang telah dibuat. Kemudian kita juga bisa memberikan international best practice yang tentunya menjadi semacam contoh gitu, contoh yang apa yang sudah dilakukan negara lain secara internasional di bidang energi bersih ini, bisa menjadi acuan oleh Provinsi Bali untuk mencapai Bali energi bersih ini.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed that session. That sort of demonstrates the people-centered approach that we take in Indonesia, especially in our projects and pilot sites. And it shows the local engagement in relation to policy development work, not just in terms of taking on the top-down sort of best practices, but rather listening and engaging with some local authorities and experts in the field in relation to developing policy reform agendas at that local level. That then brings us very nicely to the next segment, which is a panel session where we feature our experts on the ground from Indonesia to share their local insights. We have here today Yeni Indra, who's GBPN's Indonesia Subnational Project Lead. Yeni is qualified in sustainable development professional with focus on research and program implementation. She's very experienced in policy and regulatory reform and experienced also in gender program development and activities planning. We've also got John Respati, who's the head of Indonesian Energy Conservation and Efficiency Society, and he's a senior activist and a long-time advocate for clean energy development for low carbon and sustainable development. John has an intimate knowledge of government clean energy policy regulations, and he has a great passion for seeing energy efficiency as the first fuel and for seeing its strategic role in national and global energy transition. With that, we commence this panel session with some questions to both Yeni and John. We'll perhaps start with Yenny. Yenny, could you explain how some of the policy strategies have been applied in Samarinda? So Sandra has put forward 7 of those key policy strategies. From your experience, how subnational initiatives could catalyze change and action some of those policies in relation to decarbonization efforts?
So thank you, Jess, for the opportunity. This is quite interesting. Like Sandra already mentioned, how we shape up the strategy to enable the people-centered approach. And that's people-centered approach not just stop at the first strategy, but also goes along to all the entire strategy from strategy 1 to strategy 7. So this approach was like focusing on what are the people needs at the subnational level. This is encourage the process of consultation and also aware of what are the need, the things that needed by the local government. And at the same time, this also enable the process of data collection and also capacity building. So the process itself help manage the process to shape people and to be ready with the implementation of the policy. So I mean to develop and the measuring effort of the building sector and decarbonization at the local level. Samarinda City now as at the middle stage of identifying what are the things that can be applied in Samarinda. So those are the context things that we bring along with the process, making sure that whatever recommendation that coming in the process is something that they need and applicable at the subnational level. So those things are the things that we are going to follow up within the process with the specific recommendation and also the policy implementation. And again, the policy implementation will enable and help to support the process to enable the local government to also monitor and also measure the capacity of the implementation.
So Yenny, on that point, can you just explain how the collaboration has taken place at that subnational level in terms of implementing some of those strategies? What were some of the actions taken on the ground to implement some of those strategies?
So this is the best part about the process, is that the key part to identify the relevant stakeholder, and during that process we identify who are the people who going to be the key champion of the process. And like Sandra already mentioned, these key champion people are people who has the commitment and also to have the capacity to follow up with the process. And having that process, we involving not only the government of Samarinda, but also the local university of Samarinda, also the association that related to building sector in Samarinda, and also even at the private sector, we involve the process during the consultation and also during the data collection. So those process from the beginning of the process up to the analysis of the process toward the recommendation of the policy is involving all these relevant stakeholder. And this process allows people to also at the same time aware that this is something that going to be happen in Samarinda. The green building and low carbon building is a theme and policy that will be happen in Samarinda. So it enables people to understand what are the things that they will can support with the process.
Good points there, Yenny. And I think just to note, that's really applying the coalition approach, where we bring into not just local government, but we also enable the education sector. So in Samarinda, we work with UNTAG University and also with other agencies, for example, industry bodies like the Institute of Architects at the local level, in relation to coming together to develop those policy recommendations to the local government. So that's interesting to note in terms of the traction you've had working at that local level. And I think it's all about building relationships, isn't it? And how we connect at that level to make things work. Which then takes me on to the next part in terms of Pak John Respati, who's the head of Indonesian Energy Conservation and Energy Society. Pak John has been instrumental in terms of advocating for energy reform in Indonesia, as not just as an activist, but also I think is a bit of an academic in terms of some of the work that he's done and the research that he's done in this space. So to Pak John, what are some of the energy policy reforms that are taking place in Indonesia? And how is that moving towards scaling the ambition on decarbonizing the built environment?
Thank you, Jess. First, I would like to congratulate you, the GBPN, that choosing Samarinda as a pilot project on building the bottom-up approach in developing the green energy building, because the relevance of the future relevance of Samarinda is interesting, because as you know, the government of Indonesia is going to move the capital city of Indonesia to East Kalimantan, and that is not so far from Samarinda. So Samarinda, in my view, is going to be in the next metropolitan outside Jakarta that would support the new capital of Indonesia. Also, I appreciate, of course, the collaboration and the local expert and in the with the educational institution to build this case. As in my view, that one of the problem in Indonesia, that's an almost classical problem, is the coordination among the government branches and among central and regional or sub-governments. I do hope that this approach of yours is going to help this narrow the gap between the coordination, what the central government wants and what the sub-governments can do and will do to implement it. This is classical problem. Yeah, and then number two is, if I see the problem as a policy, is that building a regulation in Indonesia is one thing, but implementation is the devil. You know that the central government is now improving, improving the core regulation on energy efficiency and conservation. It was established for the first time in 2009. Only now is being reviewed and going to be improved. So we hope that this new core regulation is going to be issued, because that is more more rigorous, a more clear policy towards building, among other things. So of course the core regulation is not only for building, but for the other sectors of the economy.
So Pak John, sorry, carry on.
Yeah, so carry on.
So Pak John, just in terms of MASKEEI's contribution here, because I know MASKEEI has been working closely on many levels to enable such policy reform to take place. So could you perhaps give us some insight to some of the work that MASKEEI has done through perhaps enabling some of that policy reform in the energy space to take place through your own consultation and white paper development processes, for example?
So yes, for example, we have 4 groups that address the energy efficiency problems or issues in each sector of the economy. In terms of policy reform, as I just mentioned, we are very intimately involved in improving the core regulation, as I said. So we are now at the moment, we are, this morning, as a matter of fact, we are starting to review the implementing regulation. So the PP, the government regulation, is the central government regulation. It is just below the law, so it is implementing the law. But to implement the government regulation, you need ministerial decree. So we are reviewing ministerial decree to implement, to make it operational of the government regulation. One of the important that we are starting to review is on the energy management obligation. And the government now make it mandatory for certain category of entities or buildings, in this case, among other things, to perform, to conduct energy management. So in terms of building, we are closely also working together with the Ministry of Public Housing, that the criteria of the obligation to conduct a energy management, for example, is now looking at or going to base on the Ministry of PUPR, which is 5,000 square meter now. In the past, in the current regulation, it is 6,000 ton equivalent, oil equivalent. This is ridiculous, because that kind of energy is equivalent to 250 or 300 stories of building that is going to be mandated to perform energy management. Now it's reduced to 5,000 square meter or 500 ton equivalent. So it means that it's going to be to broaden the stakeholders, to broaden the houses or the buildings that have to perform energy management and energy reporting to the government. So that kind of co-regulation is needed as soon as possible. And I hope that that is going to be issued before the end of the year.
Thank you, Pak John, for those comments. I think it does sound promising in terms of the work that you're doing. It's catalyzing the reform process, or at least providing that insight to both local government, but also central government in terms of what to look at and how to go about doing it. What I hear in terms of your thoughts there is that there's a bit of a need for a whole of government approach, isn't it? We need to sort of have the Ministry of Energy, the Ministry of Public Works and Housing, the Ministry of Environment, all coming together to harmonize the policy reform strategy. Because sure, I think one of the bottlenecks perhaps is in relation to each one having regulations that perhaps don't speak to each other, in which case that could be another layer of complexity. So do you want to speak to that point, Pak John, in terms of...
Sure. Yes, you are right that the Indonesian major problem was the coordination, as I said just now, and also the separate regulation issued by the ministries. Yeah, as you know, Indonesia has conducted what we call omnibus law, and the PP number 16 of the PUPR, the public housing, is one of the example of implementing or catching the spirit and regulation approach of the omnibus law. So the PP 16 for building is very good. I think it basically is establishing a green building code, national green building code, and has to be followed by everybody. As far as the energy is concerned, once again, is the energy conservation, the new energy conservation regulation, and also that is imminent to be expected is the law of renewable energy and the government regulation on renewable energy pricing. Those three major regulations, as I said, the energy efficiency regulation, the renewable energy law, and the government regulation on the energy renewable energy pricing, will be very, very strategic to boost the clean energy development in Indonesia, including the building, of course.
That's a really good point.
Yeah,
that's a really good point, Pak John. I'm glad you raised the omnibus law, because like any new law coming in, the omnibus law has a whole gamut of different series of regulations which have an impact on various levels. I mean, it came as a result of creating job creation with the pandemic sort of coming in, but it also enabled for some sort of strategic alignment between national and subnational building regulations, for example. On that point, perhaps Yenny, did you want to speak about your experience in Samarinda in relation to the omnibus law and also some of the new regulations that have come out on a national level? How has that impacted the local, what was the local sort of reference to that?
Yeah, so this is quite interesting because just like other law that coming from national, it doesn't really follow with the well-prepared process to follow, like clear protocol on what are the things that the local regulation needs to follow. So having that in mind, what happened with the subnational is that they need to like find the way, like John have already mentioned, how to make the alignment between the national regulation and the subnational regulation. And it has never been easy to do that because
absolutely not.
Yeah, absolutely not. And then because of the limitation and also the capacity at the local level also limited.
Exactly.
That's another challenges that holds the process at the subnational level. But I think this is something that the national government also can support the local government with, because by providing a clear process and also a clear protocol and also a good system in place on a particular national regulation will help the implementation. So if you, John, you mentioned that there will be some kind of implementation strategy coming from national level, that will be helps a lot for the city government and the local government to work with the situation. And then having in mind that Indonesia have 550 local regulation, and they have decentralized capacity to work also on their own regulation. So having that point at the same time and having the omnibus law implementation, it's also an opportunity on how to tweak the process and find the right entry point toward this low carbon building target.
Excellent.
So again,
I agree to that. And for example, the PP number 16 is an effort from the government, for the standard government to be inclusive, to to help the subnational like Samarinda, because as I understand, the PP number 16 is on the National Green Building Code. It will eliminate the need for the local government to issue their own regulation. So it will be top down.
Excellent point, Pak John.
Yeah.
On that one, I'm just noting we are sort of running for time, but I like the point in which both you and Yenny have talked about that law, because the law actually, what I note, creates an opportunity. So that's a great thing. We have got 2 minutes to go, and we've got some closing remarks. And there may be some questions from the audience. I would encourage if you could put that in the chat box, just so we can proceed with the closing remarks, because we are brevity of time. We perhaps proceed as planned. So with the closing remarks, I'll perhaps first head to Peter. Do you want to add some comment?
Thanks, Jez, and thanks everybody for sharing those really important insights from the field. I just want to bring in the context of 2030 and connecting it back to some of the key messages that have been put through the pavilion in other sessions this week, that in order for us to stay on track to meet the Paris targets and 2050 goal of zero emissions, we have to halve building sector emissions in 8 years. And we've heard calls for deep and radical collaboration. And I think what we've seen today from the teams in Indonesia with the 7 strategies, and also even from stakeholder engagement from the top-down level, is that this people-centered approach is what this kind of deep and radical collaboration looks like. And we need to really enable that, because it is these people that are going to make this transition possible. And that is really, I I think to perhaps paraphrase what Jane said at the beginning, that it's not just about policy at the end of the day, it's about people. Thanks, Jez.
Thank you, Peter. And on that note, perhaps just another closing remark that we'd like to see Indonesia move forward with buildings as part of the NDC. So I think a lot of the work that we are doing in Indonesia will perhaps lead towards that. And Jane, did you want to add a final mark before we move to the last video clip?
No, I just want to thank the team for all the amazing work. As you can see, we have a fantastic team on the ground. So I'm good. I think we'll just close there and finish on time. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Jane. And to close, we've got a video clip to demonstrate the core benefits approach that we're taking. Peter, did you want to add comment there?
No, it's still all about people, where we live, where we work, where we learn. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. May I thanks? Can you listen? May I thanks from Glasgow and COP26 Building Pavillion, the job done by GBPN, and the really great engagement of an Indonesian stakeholder in the transition to more sustainable and high efficiency buildings. Thank you very much. It's very interesting to see your really great engagement in that part. Thank you.
Thank you, and great to see you, Regis. Thank you. Okay.
Ya, saya merasa lebih baik karena kan kalau di tempat sebelumnya anak saya terlalu kena di air gitu, airnya kotor karena kan banyak ininya luka-luka gitu kayak semacam biang keringat Kalau di sini kan alhamdulillah dia lebih sehat, kulitnya pun nggak sensitif karena kan airnya juga kan kejaga, lingkungannya juga kejaga, kebersihannya kejaga, jadi ya lebih puas lah tinggal di sini.
Thank you. And that brings a close to the session. Thank you and see you in COP27.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you next time. Thank you.